Hello there, everyone. I hope you all are having a nice night tonight. It's very pleasant to see you all. Today, we're going to be doing our first ever on-stream live reading after dinner. I hope you all are as excited as I am. Today's story comes to you courtesy of DWaM. DWaM, D-W-A-M. It's just now occurring to me that I've never heard this man's name said out loud before, so I've had no reason to learn the proper pronunciation. I believe it's meant to be an acronym for Dude with a Mask, but, I never cared enough to look it up, to be honest. Anyway, in accordance with brand synergy, this is a murder mystery story. Nothing particularly gruesome will be happening, at least nothing that will be described in awful, grotesque detail, but still know what you're getting into. I do not know why I am talking as though today we're going to be doing a ASMR stream. I don't even have the proper microphone for it. But nonetheless, if there's nobody else who would like to bring up any concerns before we begin, I would be happy to start the reading. The truth is in their hands. I had always lived my life under the assumption that, in spite of their numerous flaws, human beings were, at their core, good. I remember when I first told you this, we sat exactly as we do now. We drank the exact same bottle of brandy, from these exact same glasses, and even that look you're giving me is no different from the one back then. I think you asked me, how does someone who sees so much senseless violence on a daily basis honestly believe that? And I told you, because I'm the naive detective. I meant it as a joke. Looking back, I wasn't too far off. Unfortunately for me, it's one of the worst combinations there is. Detectives are stubborn as mules, and naive people are ruined if their naive beliefs are shattered. Well, here I am now. Too proud to admit that I was wrong, and too hurt with the realization that I should have never believed I wasn't. Brandy's helping a little. You being here is helping a bit. All just bits, though. Nothing changes the bottom line. The bottom line is that everything feels terrible. I've seen the junkies that stab random people on the street for as little as a few bucks. I've seen the kind of man who strangles his wife after she gives him a funny look. I've seen dead children. I've seen evil. Real, true evil. And every single time, I turned my head and believed in the exact opposite. The naive detective believed. Honestly, the whole job felt like peeking into another world. You see it happen, but none of it really settles in. At home, all you have to do is shut the curtains, and that's that. What happened that day? What case files did you read? Who died? Who suffered? Who lived? My mind would keep thinking, and I would answer, who cares? It's a different world from the one I lived in. It didn't matter. Now it does. Now, I know it always did. David Frome was the senior editor for ZIX. You've heard of it, right? As far as the tabloids go, it's no sleazier than the rest, but hardly what you'd call an example of journalism with integrity. Frome was a veteran of the business with the reputation of getting stories out quick and dirty. The dirtier the better. and he clung to that reputation like moth to a flame, since he didn't have much else going on. His wife divorced him 3 years ago. Took the kids, the house, the pool cleaner, the whole package. He had no choice but to move to a tiny apartment downtown. Being in his mid-50s, unable to relate to his co-workers, and not much of a looker, he mostly kept to himself. His life was a straight line between the office and the apartment. None of his neighbors knew anything about him besides the name. Yet it was exactly one of those neighbors that realized something was up. On November 3rd, around 7:30 p.m., the station got a call that the door to Frome's apartment was ajar. The caller was a single mother living 2 doors down, too afraid to go in and have a look for herself. 3 minutes after, one of the other tenants called in about seeing a masked man in a ceremonial robe of some kind leaving the building, covered in what he thought was blood. A patrol car got down there pretty quickly and stepped into Frome's apartment. They entered a small hallway with 4 doors. One to the left of the entrance, one directly across, and the other 2 to the right. The officers immediately noticed traces of blood on the floor and conducted a search. The first thing they checked was the first door on the right. It led to a small bathroom. There was a crack in the corner of the mirror above the sink, but beyond that they found nothing of suspicion and moved on to the room directly across. This was a kitchen, consisting of a stove, cupboards, shelves, a fridge, and a small dining table across the door, right under a window. There was an open box of pasta on the counter and an empty pot on the stove. The other room to the right of the entrance led into a bedroom. To the right was a bed. The entire wall opposite the entrance was taken by a large bookcase. To the left, closer to the entrance, was a locked window, and underneath it, a dresser. Further along the left wall was a desk. A man was slumped over it, with his back turned to the officers. The officers quickly found that the man was dead. This was David Frome. Autopsy would show that he had been stabbed 3 times in the chest, leading to a near-instantaneous death. The knife that killed him was lodged in his chest. It was obvious at a glance nothing could be done. Behind the last door was the living room, and there, officers found a man lying on the floor, his hands and feet bound. His face was covered in blood. More importantly, though, he was alive. When calling the ambulance, they mistakenly assumed that the unconscious man must have been battered, given all the blood. The reality, though, proved to be far worse. The culprit had crudely gouged out the man's eyes. The disfigured man's name was Angel Morona, a small-time paparazzo that occasionally sold some of his works to ZTX. After he was found, he was taken to hospital. After being given some basic care, he was put in a bed and left to sleep. After he slept, he screamed. After he screamed, he cried. After he cried, he said he was ready to talk about what had happened. And man, did he talk. Frome called Morona earlier in the day and asked him to come over to his apartment. Morona thought something in Frome's voice was off. He sounded a bit agitated. It was an unusual request to begin with, a senior editor calling a lowly freelancer. Frome allegedly said he needed someone unknown. A special project. Call records confirmed Frome had placed this call at 3:30 p.m. on the day of the murder. Cell towers put him roughly around the area of his apartment. Morona said he arrived at the apartment around 6:30. Frome welcomed him at the door and ushered him into the living room. It was right around then that Morona started to realize that the matter wasn't going to be a business one. "I'm afraid," the editor confessed to him. "I'm scared something is going to kill me soon." Huh? Morona couldn't really do much but be surprised. "There's something evil lurking in this apartment," the other said. "I hear noises during the day. Footsteps. It's not coming from any of the other apartments, I'm sure of it, but I can't find the source. Sometimes it feels like there's someone in the room with me. Someone invisible. Late at night, I sometimes hear the sound of breathing. And not my own, obviously." Morona smiled. Again, what else was he really supposed to do? From, seeing the discomfort of his guest, smiled. "I'm sorry. You must think this old man has gotten a screw or two loose. For today I wouldn't have blamed you, except... well, I have reason to believe that not only this entity must definitely exist, but it wants to harm me. You see, this morning, I woke up with a mark." "A mark?" From showed the palm of his hand. Freshly carved into his skin was a mark, in the shape of the Greek letter phi. Morona remembers almost running out of the apartment then and there. Still, he did his best to reassure himself. From was a professional. At least there wasn't any blood. The old man sighed. "I don't know how it happened. Obviously, it wasn't there when I went to sleep last night, and I obviously would have noticed if someone had tried to do it while I was sleeping. I don't think I've been drugged. I can't find any puncture marks on my body. The only thing I drink is water, and I didn't taste anything funny in it today or yesterday. So I don't know how I could have been drugged. In my mind, therefore, there's no natural explanation for it." Morona scratched his head. Okay, that's great and all, really, but why am I here?" From grinned. "What do you think? You're a photographer, aren't you? Take photos of the mark. I'll write up a story on it, change the names, and add the pics for extra effect. I mean, this is the real deal, right? People buy that. Aren't you worried about the ghost? How am I supposed to fight something I can't even see? If it kills me, it kills me. I've still got a job to do." Only one thought ran through Morona's head. This dude's batshit insane. "So," From asked at last, "you in? I'll pay you the standard wage." Still, it was easy money. Sure, I guess. How hard can taking pictures of a hand be? It'd be done in 10 minutes. Great. You got your camera? Yeah, I left it in the car, though. No worries, I'll use the one on my phone. Make it more realistic. From stood up. It's in my bedroom. I'll be right back. Morona said that the living room door was left open, so we could clearly see into the entire hallway, including From going into the bedroom. No less than a minute later, he heard the old man scream. Whatever impression of Morona I might have given, he was nothing if not brave. He ran straight for the bedroom door. The scene he witnessed was identical to the one the officers on the scene saw. From slumped over his desk and unmoving. From where he was standing, although hard to see, he could swear he saw the knife sticking out of the editor's chest. Morona thought fast. Obviously, he hadn't seen anyone enter the bedroom after From, therefore the killer had either escaped through the window, impossible given that the window was locked and they were on the 5th floor anyway, or still in the bedroom. Yet the only two valid spots were under the bed and behind the door, both of which were unoccupied, and Morona swore up and down that nobody could have snuck out without him noticing. It was as if the editor had been killed by nothing. Morona stepped back into the hallway. He remembered From locking the door and setting the chain on his arrival. The killer, if one even existed, was still in the apartment. The photographer therefore decided that his best move is to escape as quickly as possible, get to his car, maybe drive off a bit, then call the police. Just as he reached the door, though, he felt a sharp pain in the back of his head. The next thing he knew was darkness, pain, screaming. If he experienced it during the culprit's torture, or if it was simply a recollection of waking up in the hospital, he couldn't say for sure. Maybe the two memories had merged. Morona himself didn't have any better ideas. Nor did he really care. For Frome, for the investigation, for the inevitable hospital bills. The light was gone. And in a way, so was he. The investigator initially put in charge of the case, his name was Hagen, wasn't sure what to think of Morona's story at first. It sounded far-fetched, but lying wouldn't have made much sense. Morona couldn't have tied himself up. Certainly not if he'd gouged his eyes out beforehand. Had Morona, for some reason, decided to cover for the culprit? There are far better ways to do it. Besides, he didn't seem all that shaken up about the old man's death that as much as he was about the damage inflicted on him. It was hard to imagine he would be covering for the culprit in that scenario. The only other possibility in which Morona lied would have been if he had killed the old man and then was subsequently attacked by a third party hiding in the apartment. But if that was the case, why make up the story about the ghost? Why not just pin the whole thing on this existing third party? For the time being, then, Hagen had no choice but to accept Morona's testimony and work his way from there. He found the mark on the palm of Frome's hand. Autopsy confirmed it was barely a day old. The wound had been disinfected and taken care of to the point where bleeding had stopped. No other marks or injuries could be found. To Hagen, the whole thing was more like a question mark than any Greek letter. Once again, if he differed to Morona's story, the implication would be that someone had snuck into Frome's apartment the night before, carved a letter into the editor's skin, and then left. The simplest conclusion would have been that Frome simply lied about it. But why? The story he intended to print was going to be altered, and Morona himself wasn't really the type to care either way. The other conclusion was that Frome was telling the truth, which would have meant the invisible intruder was a ghost of some sort. Hagen decided to simply keep the whole matter out of his mind. The mark was there. It was what it was. How it got there, he didn't know. He couldn't even justify why he was bothered by it to begin with. There was nothing proving it was connected to the murder. The coincidence was strange for sure, but the way Hagen saw it, no possible answer to the mark would explain Frome's last moments. All he knew for sure was that there was no such thing as angry spirits. David Frome was killed by a human being of flesh and bone. The knife found sticking out of the body was confirmed as the murder weapon. It bore no fingerprints. The culprit had likely wiped it clean sometime after the stabbing. The coroner placed the time of death at around half an hour to an hour before he was found, which seemed to match up with the times. A search of the bedroom found blood on the bottom of a frying pan. The culprit didn't bother to clean it properly. It was ultimately determined to belong to Morona. What the search failed to produce was the instrument used to remove Morona's eyes. According to the doctor, though, given the state of the eye sockets, the culprit ripped the eyes out with his bare hands. Easier to do than one might think, apparently. The bedroom itself was equally unsatisfying in terms of clues. The window was locked from the inside, and just like Morona had figured, there would have been no way to scale the building from it. The only thing waiting for the culprit would have been a nasty drop, and there were no splattered remains to be seen. For the sake of thoroughness, Hagen also made sure there were no secret connections between the bedroom and another room. Of course, his suspicions were confirmed. No secret passages. The desk Frome was found at didn't have much either. Small newspapers, an address book, and a computer. For an extra disappointment, the last item held nothing but work emails and a regrettable browser history. Nothing that would point to a motive or the culprit. Then again, Hagen basically knew who the prime suspect was. The robed man seen leaving the apartment building. Unfortunately, the trail seems to grow cold. There are no other reports of the masked individual. With all this in mind, Hagen came up with a basic outline of the crime. First, the culprit got into Fromm's apartment. There were no traces of break-in, so Fromm himself must have let the culprit in. The culprit, through circumstances which were impossible to guess, hid in the apartment, either with or without Fromm realizing it. The best place would have been in the bedroom. Sometime after, Morona showed up. Once Fromm got in the bedroom, the culprit jumped out of his hiding place and killed him. The culprit then somehow evaded detection. Perhaps he got out of the window, hung onto the windowsill on the outside, and Morona was just mistaken about the window being locked. Hagen wasn't exactly convinced of the explanation, but it was better than nothing. Then, seeing Morona step out of the room, the culprit re-entered the bedroom, followed Morona out onto the hallway, and struck him from behind. The killer then tied the photographer up and, likely worried Morona had seen something that could have been used to identify him, performed his operation, and left, leaving the door ajar. The single mother who placed the call about the door being ajar had likely missed the culprit leaving by just a few seconds, seeing some minutes after she called the police, the killer was seen leaving the building. With a rough timeline in mind, Hagen went about trying to find the face behind the mask. Easier said than done, all in all. With how shut in Fromm was, the only person that really knew him was his ex-wife. Hagen tried to grill her after she identified the body. He didn't have much luck. When asked who might have wanted to hurt her ex-husband, all she could say was, David hated everyone, and everyone hated David. His company tolerated him, sure, but that's because he was good at what he did. Doesn't mean they didn't hate him. And yes, I hated him too. No, I didn't kill him. Yes, I have an alibi. No, I don't know the exact time he died, but on the 3rd, I was out of town with my daughter and my boyfriend. It was a family reunion. Dozens of people who saw us. Ask them. While the word of family members wasn't the most reliable testimony, Hagen had no choice but to accept it. And by doing so, he found himself at a complete dead end. This is where I came into the story. I wouldn't have known it at the time, though. I didn't even know about the Fromm killing when I walked into Bradley Zimmer's apartment. Bradley's mother went over to his place after he hadn't responded to her calls in over a week. She found the door locked, so she tried to let herself in with a spare key. She was stopped by the chain lock. Yet she could see through the gap in the door. The apartment was covered in darkness. She thought her son was asleep and tried calling out. Then she thought she saw something move in the darkness. And she peered her poor eyes. And she saw it. Bradley's lifeless body hanging from the ceiling fan. The rope gently swaying left to right and back. He was 22, on his 3rd year at college. An average student with a decent group of friends, no real enemies, no signs of depressive behavior or mental illness in general. Which is to say, it seemed like the usual. Bradley's mother called for an ambulance on November 4th, 10:15 a.m., moments after spotting the body. I was on the scene just 2 hours later. First person I spoke to was one of the officers that arrived with the ambulance. We found Mrs. Zimmer sobbing in the hallway. The woman was absolutely beside herself. I mean, not that I blame her or anything. He glanced over at the door. The chain was set, but you could still see the body through the gap. We couldn't undo it from the outside, so me and my partner broke it down. Paramedics rushed in, but, yeah. It had already been too late. The time of death was estimated to be the night before, sometime between 10 and 11 p.m. We did a sweep through the apartment, of course, the officer continued. We didn't find anyone. I looked around. When entering the apartment, you'd pass through a short hallway and enter into the living room where Bradley's body was found. On the far wall of the room were 2 windows, both locked. The left wall was covered in photographs. Most of them showed Bradley on his fishing trips, usually with his grandfather. In the corner of the room was his work desk. The corner across it, the farther right corner, had a wardrobe. Next to the wardrobe was a TV attached to the wall. And next to it was the door that led into the kitchen. In the center of the room was a table, sandwiched between 2 sofas. One of the sofas was a pull-out. The apartment didn't have a bedroom, so this is where Bradley slept. The ceiling fan was between the farther sofa and a window, meaning that would have been easy for Bradley to hang the rope, climb up on the sofa's backrest, and then jump. Turning to the door, I could see the 2 halves of the chain. One dangling from the door, the other from the wall. Forensics deemed that the chain would have indeed been too short to set from the outside. Using a tool or a wire of some kind would have been extremely difficult, especially since moving the chain around in the chain lock wasn't easy, given the creeping rust on the metal. I went to the kitchen. A narrow room with a stove, overhead cupboards, a fridge, a microwave. A perfectly ordinary kitchen. It had no windows. From the kitchen, one could either take the door to the bathroom or the pantry. The bathroom had seen better days. The tiles were in an unnatural shade of brown. God, even now I'm hoping they didn't start out as white. There was something in one of the upper right corners, a black mold of some kind. Maybe even a nest? To be honest, I didn't want to find out. And honestly, the less said about the toilet, the better. The pantry looked pretty barren as well. It was a small, rectangular room with only a shelf across its entrance. With the exception of a few bags of chips and cans of beans, it mostly held cobwebs. What kind of life did Bradley lead here exactly? It was for the better, though. With how empty the pantry had been, I was bound to spot something wedged between the shelf and the wall. It was a wooden chair. What was left of it anyway. Its back and 2 of its legs had been broken off. Searching further, I also discovered that someone had hidden away a long length of rope. It matched the type Bradley seemingly hanged himself with. Given that they both had a cut on one of their ends, it was likely that a portion of the rope I found was cut and used for the hanging. I had to admit, it all seemed pretty clear. I went back to the living room. They were just about to take the body away for autopsy. And we didn't find much, the coroner told me. No signs of a struggle or a bruising, with the exception of the neck, of course. I didn't find any puncture marks that would suggest he was sedated, but take that with a grain of salt. Full autopsy might change it. He was definitely alive when he was hung, and the hanging must have been the cause of death. He showed me a plastic bag. In it was a key. This was the only thing in his pocket. We tested it, it's the apartment door. That should have sealed it. The door was locked when his mother discovered him, the key was in Bradley's pocket. The chain must have been set from the inside of the apartment. The windows were locked and nobody could have escaped after the door was broken down, in part because of the apartment's layout. It was suicide. I was sure of it. There was to know, but it's not like there had to be one. There was one more thing that stuck out, I guess, the coroner said, just as he was leaving. There was a wound at the palm of his hand, about a day or 2 old. Could have been self-inflicted. In fact, I'm almost convinced it was, since it looks to have been properly disinfected and treated. What did it look like? It reminded me of phi. A Greek letter, I mean. It took no longer than a day for Hagen and I to learn about each other's cases. The marks are identical, he declared, setting down the photos of the two men's hands. I'd say they were probably made by the same person. I stared out of his office window. The morning had turned sour. The clouds were grey, the downpour heavy, the coffee too bitter, and Hagen too excited. What do you think? He asked me. You said Zimmer was definitely a suicide, right? I said it. I would have kept saying it if I hadn't known about a man dying under equally strange and impossible circumstances. Hey, mine at least has some leg room, doesn't it? All I need is a way for the killer to realistically hide from Morona. You need a killer that can disappear from a sealed room. He wasn't wrong, but I didn't appreciate the tone of his voice. I knew where this was going, and it didn't sit right. So, we can safely say Zimmer had to have committed suicide. We can also safely say that the two cases are connected because of the mark. The mark made on Fromm's hand was likely made by the same person who made it on Zimmer's. It's also possible one of these marks was self-inflicted. With that out of the way, he saw fit to take the wheel. Dangerous thing. Certain trains of thought rarely have brakes built in. Let's say Zimmer's was the self-inflicted one. That would mean that Zimmer was the one who marked Fromm. Isn't the point to Zimmer killing Fromm, then going back to his apartment and offing himself? It fit the timeline. Fromm's killer was seen leaving a little after 7:30, Zimmer was dead a few hours later. That adds up, doesn't it? I pointed out that there was no connection between the two men. Well, my guys are still looking into that, he pointed back. But the mark in itself proves a connection of some kind exists, right? I conceded. Then I pointed out that the mark itself doesn't necessarily have to mean the deaths themselves were connected. As an example, I suggested the two of them could have been part of a cult. The mark symbolized their membership. If that were the case, Bradley could have decided to commit suicide for his own reasons, with someone killing Fromm for completely different ones. But that gets us back to the question of why Fromm would have lied about how he got it to Morona. Hagen pointed back once more. It was an issue he'd been running into since the start. It didn't deny my theory, if anything, it strengthened it. Fromm, being a member of some cult, decided to use the mark for unrelated means, but he didn't want Morona, or anyone else, to be aware of his membership, so he came up with the story. Did you really have to come up with a ghost, though? Given how odd the mark is, any story would have raised some eyebrows. Right, but... a ghost? I shrugged. Either way, I made my point. There was no definitive way to prove Bradley killed Fromm. Not with the information we had, at least. Well, I guess I can't argue, he admitted. Zimmer's phone had been off for the past week, which is why his mom wasn't able to get in touch with him. Come to think of it, you didn't find it at his apartment, did you? We hadn't. What about Zimmer's body? Preliminary report's done, right? At record time, too. Most of it confirmed what the coroner had told me the first time around. No bruises, no needle or puncture marks, no drugs in the system. The only thing of note was that Bradley hadn't eaten anything in days. Not too surprising, given how little food there was in the apartment. He must have been going through something dark, Hagen sighed. I've seen things like these before. I said nothing. Anyway, you never answered my first question. I didn't know what he is referring to. What do you think? Truth is, the only thing I thought was that I didn't know what to think. So I focused on the rain and said nothing, much to Hagen's dismay. Our first hope for a breakthrough came in a rather unexpected way. On November 7th, 7:31 a.m., a post was made in the random section of a popular image board. It read, "I just woke up, and found this on my hand. It hurts. I didn't do this to myself. Attached to the post was an image of what looked to be a woman's hand. Her fingers were spread open, revealing her palm. There was a wound of some kind there. It seemed to have been treated, given the few bloody bandages and the bottle of disinfectant that could be seen at the background. It was still fresh and bleeding. In spite of the blood, though, we could make out the shape. One looking exactly the same as the two ones that came before. Phi. Hagen said nothing. He and I both knew that the mark wasn't something publicly known at that stage of the investigation. That made it unlikely to be a prank of some kind. Whoever made the post was at least tangentially related to the victims. This, in turn, meant that they were likely related to the killer. Assuming the post hadn't been made by the killer to begin with. Either way, we had no means of reaching out. The poster was anonymous. If we identified ourselves as police in the comments section, it would have been dismissed immediately. As it turned out, though, we didn't have to do anything. Among the sea of responses that ranged from calling the photo fake to telling the woman to seek medical attention, one stood out almost immediately. You are going to die. This is the same mark David Fromm and Brad Zimmer had when they died. I gave it to them. They died. And you will too. We jumped. The IT guy was already trying to track the IP of whoever sent it. We didn't have high hopes, and we were right not to. The startling confirmation was more than enough in the long run. The worst-case scenario had now become the most likely. Someone had murdered two men in impossible circumstances. A serial killer. An hour later, a woman named Ginny Wilde called the station. First asked about Fromm and Bradley, and then, when she couldn't get a straight answer, identified the hand in the photo as hers. She swore everything she was saying was true. The mark wasn't on her hand when she'd gone to sleep. She didn't feel anything during the night. She swore she didn't know what the mark meant, or anything about Fromm or Bradley. We spoke in her apartment. She lived alone, no kids. She'd recently broken up with her boyfriend, which didn't really matter since they never lived together, but she felt like mentioning anyway. She was 31. Worked at the same grocery store for the past 5 years. Nothing out of the ordinary. Not even a hold-up. For a convenience store clerk, she had a nice place. The last time I sold it for pretty cheap, she said. I don't know why. And she looked at us, and her eyes grew misty, and she asked, Am I gonna die? Hagen and I said, no. And she said, I don't know what this is about. I really don't. Are you saying someone was in my house, that they did this to me? And we said, we can't rule out the possibility. And she said, I guess I should be more surprised, but over the past few days I've been hearing these noises, and I don't know. It's like there's someone in the room with me. Someone I can't see. There's footsteps and everything, and sometimes it's like they walk right past me, but there's nobody there, ever, but me. And we asked, do you know who might want to hurt you? And she said, I thought you'd know. And we looked at each other, and in that moment, one of us spat out the lie. Everything's going to be okay. And she tried to wipe her tears, but ultimately excused herself and went out into the hall. For reasons I'm not sure of, I followed. I'll be out in a sec. Sorry. She said, sniffed, and closed the bathroom door behind her. Hagen walked over. I don't buy it, he said. There's no way that 3 completely unrelated people can get mixed up in something this elaborate. Serial killers that stalk focus on one victim at a time. They get off on that shit. Thrill of the hunt and all. You're telling me our guy opted to pick 3 people completely at random and take them all down in less than a week. Doesn't add up. Our guy's quick and methodical. He's not doing this out of some feeling of pleasure. He's killing these specific people for a purpose. He blinked. That's my gut feeling anyway. Take it or leave it. I asked him if he thought Ginny was lying. She seemed scared. People who are scared often have trust issues. I'd have them too. If 2 fucking weirdos come into my apartment asking me about this and that, but not giving me straight answers when I ask back. If you ask me... That was when she screamed. We ran across the hall. I grabbed the bathroom knob. It was locked. You have to be shitting me! Hagen tried it himself. Damn it! He banged the door. Miss Wilde! Miss Wilde, can you hear me? Open the door, Miss Wilde! There was nothing. We exchanged a look. Miss Wilde, we'll break the door down. If you can hear us, try and step back. She couldn't hear us. Ginny Wilde died almost instantly for the knife that pierced her chest. She was on the ground, slumped against the bathtub. Hagen yelled. At me, at her, at himself, at the killer. I focused on the bathroom itself. No windows. Nobody hiding behind the shower curtain. Nobody behind the door. I saw her go in. I, and later Hagen, had that door within our sights the entire time. We ran straight to it when we heard the scream. The door was locked. Once we confirmed her dead, we turned the entire apartment upside down and found nothing. There was no way for the culprit to escape. It's doubtful if he could have even gotten in. And yet Ginny Wilde had a knife in her chest. The tub was across the door, Hagen began, his head falling onto his desk. The sink was to the left. The washing machine was between the tub and the sink. The toilet was between the closet wall and the sink. I think to the right was a towel rack. The key to the door was still in the lock inside. He sighed. How? How did he do it? I said I didn't know. He laughed. Now what the hell do we know? For crying out loud, somebody killed her. I flipped through the case file. The knife was her own and had only her fingerprints. And the coroner agreed that the wound could have been self-inflicted. So what the other 2 then, huh? Who killed them? Logically, I argued she could have been the culprit behind the first 2 killings. She then concluded with the suicide to throw the investigation off. That doesn't make sense. Throw what off exactly? We didn't even know who she was until she called us herself. A good point. I had ways to counter it, of course, but there was no proof. No connection between the victims and no convincing explanation for any of the deaths. Baiting Ginny was a breakthrough that ran us straight into another brick wall. My theory that Ginny was the culprit came into question fairly quickly. We learned that for November 3rd, she had a shift from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. Store security footage confirmed this, meaning she had an alibi for Fromm's death. The next blow came to the idea that she'd committed suicide. Unlike the other 2, Ginny's apartment building had security cameras at its entrance to the main lobby and each of the building hallways. Roughly 15 minutes before Ginny's death, an individual wearing ceremonial robes and a mask walked into the building. 16 minutes later, he left. This was captured only on the entrance camera. No camera on any of the floors captured the robed individual. None of the other cameras in the building showed anyone getting anywhere close to her apartment in general, with the exception of me, Hagen, and the investigative team that came roughly half an hour after her death. How had the killer struck then? He clearly never made it past the lobby, and still, Ginny Wilde had a knife in her chest. Speaking to the witness from the From incident, we at least confirmed the suspect seen leaving From's building a little after 7:30 p.m. wore those exact same robes. Our culprit had a body, but who was he? I'm a bit embarrassed to admit it, but I became a bit fixated on that piece of footage. I wanted to see something, anything. A part of the body the killer had accidentally left exposed. Skin color, hair color, perhaps there was something in the way he walked, the way he touched the door, a material in the robes that could have come from only one store in town. In the end, we had no choice but to turn to the public for help. Keeping most of the details about Ginny's death, part because of our own embarrassment, in part because we wanted to keep them maintain a lid on the mark, we released the footage of the culprit. Thousands of calls came in, pouring in from all over the city. None checked out. Not a single one. A week later, on November 15th, a man walked into the police station, saying someone had assaulted him in his home. According to him, an unknown individual had harmed him while he slept. When asked about the wound, he produced the mark on the palm of his hand. The fourth eye. His name was Tristan Fell. He was 38-year-old accountant for a small law firm. For a brief period, we hoped he was the missing link we'd been looking for. It took only 5 minutes of interrogating to dash those hopes. I'm really sorry, he said. I've never heard of these people. Hagen grinned. I find that hard to believe. They've been all over the news. The accountant shrugged. I don't watch the news. Too depressing these days. Hagen clicked his tongue. Let's talk about the mark then. They sent a unit to check it out, but I'll ask anyway. Did you find any traces of a break-in? No, I lived in an apartment on the 6th floor. The windows were all locked up, and I'm sure I locked the door when I came home from work last night. I had it replaced recently, too. State of the art. Not something you can pick. Or, so they told me. You live alone? Yes. Any spare keys? The only spare I have I gave to my sister. And she moved out of the country 2 years ago. Besides, even if the culprit somehow had a spare, they shouldn't have been able to use it. I always leave the key in the lock. I consider if the culprit had somehow twisted the key from the outside. The accountant chuckled. I really don't think that's possible. It's a double-cylinder lock. They couldn't even reach the key from the outside. I asked him if he felt any pain when the mark was inflicted. Once again, he shrugged. No. I guess that's pretty weird. There any way I could have just slept through it? Hagen chimed in again. It depends. You want any sleeping medication? No? Did you believe the culprit could have maybe planted a sedative in your food or drink? Well, you guys would probably find out faster than me. That said, I doubt it. Nothing tasted funny. Actually, I didn't even have dinner at home last night. I stopped by a restaurant on my way from work. Hagen sighed. The same story, again. Someone was taking us for a ride. I suggested to Mr. Fell that he spent the night at the station. The killer seemed to kill his victims the same day they woke up with the mark, and I was doubtful Fell would be an exception to the rule. Do I have to? He scratched his head. I mean, I appreciate it and all, but can't you, just send someone to watch over my house? We could have, but the memory of Ginny was still fresh in our minds. Whether it was shame or guilt, we wanted to do everything in our power to stop it from happening again. Well, Fell finally said after some awkward convincing. I guess I don't have work today anyway. But, only today, if that's okay. We decided to place him in an isolated holding cell. It was on the second floor of the police station, with only a window, a sink, a toilet, a bed, and the door. A security camera in one of the corners of the ceiling, and we made sure Fell himself had nothing that could have been used as a weapon just in case. There was no guarantee that Fell living that day would get the killer to give up on him, but it would have been a victory. Of some kind, surely. I sat in the office, going through the case files for God knows what time. Hagen was resting in his chair, staring at the live feed of Fell's cell. The first incident, from the senior editor, Morona the blinded photographer. The incident was more like a mission statement than anything. It felt as if Morona wasn't the only one blinded. From the very moment the investigation began, we were stumbling around in the dark. I went through Frum's computer again. Nothing but emails. It looked as if they were his exclusive means of interaction with people. Nobody liked him, but it didn't seem like he could have gotten someone to harbor a grudge against him specifically. Especially someone who he'd never even met face to face. Does he have an alibi? Hagen suddenly asked. Fell, I mean, does he have an alibi for the other killings? He had. Mr. Bradley's. On the 3rd, he was at a conference, from 8 p.m. to 2 in the morning. Hagen clicked his tongue. Mentioning Bradley got me to look into his computer. Forensics didn't seem to find anything useful there, either. No threatening messages on social media, not even so much as a long-winded, pointless argument on Twitter. His interests were varied, and nothing in the posts leading up to his death suggested he was intending to commit suicide. In fact, he was discussing possibly meeting some of his online friends in the near future. What if we're thinking about this all the wrong way? Hagen chimed in again. What if the killer's objective was to kill only one person and the others were just a smokescreen? I think he has to try and find a connection where it doesn't exist. It was a good thought, but it didn't help us in the long run. The nature of our work had seen us pick out people in the victims' lives to begin with, and nobody happened to stick out. We must have missed something, Hagen concluded. But how much was there to miss? I focused on Ginny next. I remembered she'd mentioned something about breaking up with her boyfriend recently, and her last few posts on social media seemed to back it up. She sounded absolutely crushed by it. No wonder she mentioned it. The pain of it must have been constantly on her mind. Was that enough to think that she might have committed suicide after all? It still would have explained the robed figure. Then why would she have screamed, and why would she have gotten the mark? Hagen buried his head in his hands. What if they all killed themselves? What if, I don't know, somehow the mark forced them to do that? It'd explain everything. How Fromm could have been killed right in front of a room that nobody but him was found in, how Zimmer hanged himself, how the killer got past us and killed Wilde. A magical mark that compelled victims to suicide. Look, I don't know anymore, alright? It's just an idea. But the idea was weak. Who disfigured Morona, then? Who wiped the prints from the knife that was in Fromm's chest? Who was the figure in the robes? Hagen resigned. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore at this point. Damn it. I stood in a long corridor. One of the shadows on the wall was mine, but I couldn't tell which one. All were distorted, twisted, bizarre, and all followed my movements ever so perfectly. One of them was definitely mine, I knew that much. I also knew one of them was an enemy. It wasn't even a shadow, really. It was an entity that wormed itself into the sanctity and safety of one's home, feasted on the air of its occupants, got to know them, accepted them, and then buried itself in them like the true parasite that it was. But not in their body, in their shadow. They would hear its footsteps. They would feel its presence, even when alone. Of course they would. It was right there. It was a part of them. Watching. During the night, though, it wouldn't do much more than watch. I walked down the hallway. The shadow followed. The enemy followed. The others followed. Who were the others? I wasn't sure. Perhaps they were the shadows the entity had replaced. The shadows of the victims that were falling. I reached a door. I pulled on the knob for no more than a few inches when it stopped. A gap had formed, held by a chain lock. And the chain refused to move. Suddenly, one of the shadows jumped from the wall and slid through the gap, slamming the door behind it. I'd realized my mistake. I let the enemy in, and locked myself out. When banging on the door didn't work, I began to throw my body against it. It shook, but refused to break. The chain was strong. I'd need enough force to rip it off, either from the wall or the door. And I was weak. I turned around, spotting another door. I went towards it. This one was held back by nothing. I simply stepped into the room. The room had only a table, and on the table was a jar, and in the jar floated a pair of eyes. Our gaze met. The pair of eyes blinked. When I followed suit, I found myself somewhere else. A decrepit little bathroom. I was standing in the center next to the sink, but I saw myself in the bathtub, too. The other me wasn't moving. There was a knife sticking out of his chest. On the palm of his hand was a mark I'd come to know well by that point. What did it mean, anyway? Phi. Why not Delta? Or Omega? Why Phi? Was it even supposed to mean anything? Were any of these deaths supposed to mean anything? Then again, I knew serial killers never really need an understandable explanation behind their actions. Why was I convinced there was a point to all of this? I tried to open the door, but it was locked. No key to be found either. The only place left to look was the mirror. It was me. I knew it was me. But my reflection showed someone else. I reached out to this stranger, and the stranger reached back. Our fingers touched on the cracked glass. Somewhere, a door opened. I had fallen asleep on my desk. The room was covered in darkness, with the exception of our computer monitors. Hoggins illuminated his face, leaning backwards, his eyes closed, gently snoring away. I looked at the corner of the monitor. It was past 10. The sun had set a long time ago. And there were no city lights to be seen. They were lost amidst another heavy downpour. As you might remember, that night ended up causing quite a few floods all over town. Ever since I was a kid, there was this strange thought in the back of my head that told me that the rain meant the world was crying over me. That it pitied me. I sighed. What had I been doing when I fell asleep? Checking the footage of Jenny's apartment building. I'd seen it a million times before by that point. I wasn't expecting to learn anything new. And I didn't. But in that moment of clarity, as the world cried, I realized there was nothing more to learn. The footage in itself was the answer. Its very existence pointed to something so simple and obvious that I should have realized it from the very beginning. And working backwards from there, I realized several other things. The gouged eyes, the chain lock, the mark, and more importantly, killer's identity. Hagen and I brought Fell back to the interrogation room. I hadn't explained anything to Hagen, but he didn't protest. Was he too exhausted to argue? Or did he see the gleam in my eyes and choose to blindly trust me? Either way, there would have been no point in arguing. I knew the truth. Did you, change your mind? Fell asked us. To be honest, I'd hate to go out in this rain. I began with my explanation. I chose to begin with Ginny's death because it was what tipped me off to the whole thing. As established before, the bathroom door was locked. It was too small to hide in, and the hallway was watched. Entire time. In addition, the fingerprints on the knife were hers, and the coroner agreed the wound could have been self-inflicted. How could the culprit have killed her? It's simple. He couldn't have. This wasn't even a case of Occam's razor. The simplest solution wasn't only the best one, it was the only one. Ginny Wilde had committed suicide. She'd had the knife from the moment we'd walked into the apartment, likely hidden under her clothes. Or maybe she'd stashed it away in the bathroom ahead of time. Either way, she was planning for the deed from the start. She contacted us and got us to come over so we would be witnesses. Then she went to the bathroom and stabbed herself. And why would she do that? Fell asked. I admitted I didn't know, but there was no other answer. Isn't that just lazy thinking? The accountant asked. Either way, Hagen interjected. What about the cloaked figure? And the mark? It was an excellent question. Why had the figure seen leaving Frome's apartment appeared as close as 15 minutes before Ginny's death? It couldn't have been a coincidence. But knowing Ginny committed suicide, what would that have meant? Hagen caught on. It was planned. Wilde told the robed figure to walk into the apartment building and get caught on the footage. Coordination would have been easy. The accomplice only had to loiter around outside, waiting for the two of us to show up, put on the robe, and enter. After that, they went into the bathroom on the ground floor, waited for 15 minutes, and left. The impression would have been that the Phantom Killer had gotten into the building and pulled off some kind of a trick to kill Ginny as if walking through walls. And the mark? The mark had obviously been staged too. And the implication of that fact in particular had led me to the truth. Ginny and the accomplice had planned the suicide. To do so, they lured us to the apartment building with the poster at the mark. It was all an act. Then the threatening response left by the culprit must have also been part of the plan. The knowledge about the mark was not public knowledge. Because of this, we knew the response to the threat was made by the culprit. And if Ginny and the poster had been working together, then she was involved in the first two murders. Exactly. This charade had all been a two-person job from the start. Continuing to work backwards, I continued with Bradley's death. Bradley's murder. Once one accepts that Bradley had been murdered, several other things immediately became a lot clearer. If Bradley hadn't hanged himself, why had there not been any signs of a struggle in the body or any traces of drugs? It was hard to believe that Bradley wouldn't have resisted at one point or another. The answer must have been that he couldn't have, and the only explanation for that would have been the fact that he'd been starved. In other words, Bradley hadn't been starving himself because he was depressed. The culprits had been intentionally starving him to stop him from fighting back when it came time to do the hanging. The process would have had to take several days. In fact, I wagered it was about a week. Just around the time Bradley stopped responding to his mother's texts. The culprits were likely one of the people Bradley had met online and agreed to meet with in real life. He let them into his apartment, and they, in turn, subdued him. The broken chair and the rope I'd found behind one of the shelves were likely used. Whatever immediate bruises he could have gotten at the point would have healed by the time for the hanging occurred. Wait, Hagen interrupted me. Didn't you say you were looking over Bradley's posts in the week leading up to his death? How was he posting while being tied up? That was another part of the culprit's scheme. Now having control of his apartment, they could have simply logged onto his computer and continued posting as him. But you didn't find any messages concerning Bradley meeting up with someone, because the culprits had likely deleted the ones concerning them. While I was on the subject, I pointed out that the reason Bradley's phone was missing was likely because the culprits had exchanged actual text messages with Bradley, which they couldn't delete. So they just took it and got rid of it. Wait, Phil spoke. I thought you mentioned earlier the apartment was all locked up. Since they had a week of total control of his apartment, going out to make a spare key would have been easy enough. To be honest with you, looking back on it, the trick with the chain was something I should have realized far, far earlier. As soon as I first saw it, really. Chain-on-chain locks are very strong, generally. It's the reason why people usually have to bring out bolt cutters to get past them. It's a safety feature for a reason. And yet, the officers were easily able to break the door down in such a way that the chain split itself in half. They didn't break off the part attached to the wall. They'd broken the chain itself. This proved that the chain was unnaturally weak. Or rather, that it had a weak link, if you will. The culprits had first set the chain on the inside of the apartment. Then they cut it with bolt cutters, right in the middle. They stepped outside, grabbed the two dangling halves, then put them together with a new link of their own. One which was substantially weaker and one which they could have easily put on or removed. After that, they simply closed the door fully and locked it with their spare key. Incidentally, this was also why Bradley's murder didn't have the appearance of the robed figure. The culprit would have likely had to take a while, as standing out in the hallway reattaching their chain. Because of this, they couldn't afford to stick out like a sore thumb. With normal clothes, if anyone had caught them, they could have lied that they were trying to get the chain to come off, because they'd seen the body through the gap in the door. Well, who killed him? Allian asked. I was willing to bet it was Ginny. She didn't have the alibi for this murder. Fell simply stared ahead. Finally, there was Frome's murder. Probably the most elaborate one. The answer to this murder had been hidden in plain sight, quite literally. We just didn't realize it because we hadn't been asking the right questions. The most important question being, why had the culprit gone through the trouble of gouging out Morona's eyes? Hagen had suggested that it was because Morona had supposedly seen something incriminating. But if the culprit had been worried about Morona seeing something, why hadn't he simply struck before or after Morona arrived? It didn't add up. The culprit had clearly deliberately acted because Morona was there, but why do something so cruel to him? There's only one answer I could come up with. It wasn't about what Morona saw in the apartment. On the contrary, everything Morona saw was exactly what the culprit wanted him to see. It was about what Morona could have seen after that would have made the entire plan worthless. Hagen's eyes slowly widened. After? What do you mean? What I meant was that, had Morona not been blinded, then and there, he would have eventually told us that the man he'd met in the apartment that day, and the man he'd seen slumped over the desk, was not the same man we'd find hours later. The timeline as I'd seen it went something like this. Early that morning, the culprit paid a visit to Frome and attacked him. There could have been a small struggle at this point which resulted in the bathroom mirror getting cracked. The one hurt would have been the culprit because Frome's autopsy revealed no trace of any obvious injury. The culprit eventually got him in a chokehold, which caused the old man to pass out. He then tied the victim up, carved the mark on both of their hands, treated the injuries, and moved into the second stage of the plan. He picked out a name from Fromm's address book. Fromm himself generally dealt with people strictly through email, meaning there were a fair bit of them who'd never seen him face to face. To be absolutely sure, the culprit picked out from guest contributors, freelancers who would have had no reason to have ever met the senior editor. Morona arrived at 6:30. The one who greeted him then was the culprit. The culprit led him into the living room, told him the story about the mysterious mark that inexplicably got on his hand the night before, then went off to the bedroom. There, he faked being dead, the knife sticking out of his chest just a prop. Morona saw the scene and, as expected, panicked. The culprit swiftly knocked the photographer out. He then moved from the bathroom and stabbed him. Another thing we should have figured out earlier was that it was unlikely Fromm could have ever been ambushed in the bedroom as assumed beforehand. The knife was found sticking out of his chest, while a culprit sneaking up on him would have had a much easier time stabbing him in the back or the neck. After having his eyes gouged out, Morona would only be able to refer to Fromm through words, and the police themselves would have had no reason to describe the old man in too much detail. The position of the body matched, so did the mark on his hand. The culprit then put on his robes and left. The robes were intentional from the beginning. The culprits needed it to be able to throw us off for Ginny's death later. Hagen blinked. I take it to mean the other culprit was behind this. I nodded. Do you know who it is? I did. It was simple logic from there. Because the person Morona met was the culprit, the story about the mark appearing in the middle of the night was made-up nonsense. Because Ginny was always part of the guilty party, her story about the mark appearing in the middle of the night was also made-up nonsense. And yet, sitting across us was a man claiming the same made-up nonsense happened to him. Fell didn't seem bothered in the slightest. So, what? Are you saying I'm this other culprit? If he wasn't, he had to have at least been involved. The mark still wasn't public knowledge, meaning this couldn't have been some kind of prank. Your theory still doesn't make that much sense to me. If I were the culprit, why would I walk in here and make myself exposed like this? I admitted I didn't know. No? Okay, how about this? I bothered with the marks in the first place, then. What do they even mean? Hagen scratched his chin. They, of course, didn't mean anything. They needed a symbol, and they used the first one that came to mind. The marks themselves served several roles. One, they were necessary to solidify the trick with Morona. By giving the mark, they were able to have a distinguishing feature that would have confirmed it both in Morona's mind and the police's that they were referring to the same person. Two, it was necessary to connect Fromm's and Bradley's deaths. As long as the police believed they were dealing with one culprit, and we had no real reason to believe otherwise, the culprits would have had an alibi for at least one of the deaths. Jimmy for Fromm's, Fell for Bradley's. 3. The story of the mark, the idea that it was given while sleeping without the person waking up, was used to further confuse the issue. The unidentified noises and the footsteps would have made us think the phantom killer was secretly living in their home, or it would have made us believe the victims were involved in the occult. 4. They were a convenient excuse for Ginny to reach out for the police and have definite witnesses when she committed suicide. Fell said nothing. I told him he clearly lied to us. Fell said nothing. I told him that the carving on his hand is nothing more than a reopened wound from when he killed Fromm. If he'd traced it, he didn't do so perfectly, and a medical examination would likely prove it. It's a good thing I don't agree to an examination, he said at last. Furthermore, do you have any evidence of me being on any of the scenes? Hey, weren't you listening? Your own story proves... Phil shook his head. It was a prank. A friend of mine put me up to it. Which friend? Hagen demanded. Sure, I'll write it down. We moved to Iceland a few days ago, though. I don't think he'll be able to get him for an interview. He turned back to me. Now, do you, or do you not, have any physical evidence to back up any of your claims? I said nothing. Do you have anything that places me on any of the crime scenes? I said nothing. Can you prove I ever had contact with any of these people, online or otherwise? I said nothing. There's a search of your apartment going on right now, Hagen said. I won't find anything of note. Anything else? I said nothing. In that case, I think I'll be taking my leave, Fell declared and left the room. Hagen swore. I said nothing. Tristan Fell lived on the 7th floor of a high-rise apartment building. He was more successful than he let on. The building's security was pretty lax. Getting by the guard was as simple as just waiting for a moment when his attention was drawn elsewhere. I took the long way up. The elevators had cameras installed. The hallways, interestingly enough, didn't. Even if they had, I was wearing a disguise anyway. Apartment 712. I'd followed him on his way from work. I also knew what he'd promised. The door was new and state-of-the-art, but I suspected I wouldn't have much trouble getting in. I just rang the doorbell, and he opened. I pushed him into the doorway, slamming the door behind him. Really? We're really going to do it like this? He asked. He'd just gotten out of the shower and was wearing nothing but a towel. I asked him why. He sighed. ZTX is a leech, building itself from other people's misery. Frome was the worst of them all. His wife didn't leave him because she found herself a new guy. She left him because he was an abusive asshole. At the height of ZTX a few years ago, he was on top of the world. And people on top of the world are more inclined to have a march through hell. You don't know half the stuff he did, and trust me, you don't want to. When the tabloid business started to decline, he became withered and old, too. Mrs. Frome saw it as her only chance, and she took it, God bless. How had he found that out, though? He grinned. A friend of my cousin's is her pool cleaner. In other words, he had no direct relation to Frome. I didn't know. I asked him about Bradley. Oh, he was, I admit, a means to an end more than anything. Like you said the other day, another death would have helped me with an alibi later down the line. I wanted to have all my bases covered. I couldn't wrap my head around how he chose him. Oh, we met online, like you said. He told me how he lived, showed me photos of his apartment, that disgusting bathroom of his. Jesus. He was rotting away, barely going anywhere. He was even miserable to justify it. He just didn't care. He was quite literally a waste of life. His mother would have begged to differ, as all good mothers were. But good mothers don't necessarily give good children, do they? I asked him about Ginny. I once stopped by her convenience store. I'd never stopped there before. There was a flood and I had to stop on my way from work. Couldn't stop at the usual place. She looked miserable. Her boyfriend had just left her and I took a chance and started talking with her. I can't really describe her. She'd given up on living too. She just chose to follow along. To be a puppet. All because of some guy that probably couldn't appreciate what he had. She never questioned any part of the plan. The suicide part was her addition while planning. I didn't stop her. I didn't. No. If she wanted to go, she was free to. How was it any of my responsibility? I gritted my teeth. I only had one last question. Why had he showed up at the station? That was to wrap everything up. If I had left things as they were, you would have probably decided there was no other explanation but Ginny committing suicide. From there, you would have figured out that 2 culprits were involved, that Ginny herself was in on it. From there was a small chance that you could have gotten to me. All of which you did. But I hoped you wouldn't. The way it was meant to happen was that I would talk to you. You'd mention the other victims, the mark. I even guessed you'd try to protect me. But you'd have had to leave me alone eventually. Then I'd go online, spill the beans on the mark and the related victims. The stranger that creeps into people's houses. Visible phantom that's right there. You just can't see him. You'd know it was me posting it, and I'd play dumb. Say I didn't realize how seriously you wanted me to keep a lid on it. And the internet would do the rest. You'd have people all over the country posting about how they woke up with a strange carving on their hand, but how the stranger with the robes was in a bedroom of a woman 2 cities over. Fiction would overtake the truth. You'd have to look into all of them, until eventually you got tired and gave up. When you realized you were chasing a newly born urban legend. I froze. That's what it had all been about. People die and are eventually forgotten. Cheap tabloids chasing petty short-term drama. College kids who end up making nothing of their life, just becoming another cog in the machine. Grocery store workers who spend years on the exact same place. Accountants who work for small-time law firms. Each and every one of us is going to be forgotten. But a story, a legend, has a chance. It has a chance to outlast. It's a small chance, but people remember horrific crimes. People remember the mysteries. People remember the intrigue. It was all for a story. A true crime story that had spiraled into an urban legend. It had all the makings of one. A mysterious mark, impossible murders, gore. I hit him over the head. I don't remember with what. And I hit him again. And again. And again. And again. And once more for good measure. And then I left. I didn't know I'd killed him with the first hit. I didn't know that nobody would find him for a week. I didn't even care whether or not they'd catch me after I did. All I thought about was leaving that building. When I did, I saw it again. The world was crying. I had always lived my life with the assumption that, in spite of their numerous flaws, human beings are at their core good. But I killed a man in cold blood. And even if I didn't know I'd killed him at the time, I enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed hurting him. How can I say that human beings are good when I myself am not good? And no, don't try to argue, don't try to tell me otherwise. I feel it. Deep down, I feel that I've done something horrible. Regardless of what I might have felt at the time, regardless of how much hell it deserved it. That just makes it worse, doesn't it? If what I've done is horrific, then how do we measure what Fell had done? What Ginny had done? What Frome had done? How could any of those people possibly have been good at their core? I can see the way you're looking at me. And I agree. You should look at me. No wonder the world is crying all the damn time. And that's the stream. Thank you, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. DWaM has been a favorite author of mine for quite a while now, and I chose this story as our first reading because it's very much a tour de force of everything I think he does well in stories. You have multiple solid impossible crimes, a fair amount of cluing with solutions that make sense, but also that sort of emotional core. A protagonist who's well characterized as psychological realism, and with our motive being to write a good story, a very meta-conscious sort of Japanese Shunhankaku style meta-fictional aspect that manages to add flavor without being, self-indulgent the way a lot of metafiction is. I hope you enjoyed the story. I do plan on doing more of these. Maybe on a weekly basis, maybe less. I don't have that many stories prepared. But I do take requests. But I believe that will be the end of our stream for today. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope to see you all later. Farewell.